really lovely introduction, so thank you. Yeah, very kind as ever and generous. Helen and I have been working together on a project, as Sabina said, called Identity, Inequality and the Media in Brexit COVID-19 Britain. I'm a social anthropologist and ethnographer, and Helen is a fine artist. We are part of a larger team with diverse skills, including other ethnographers, and they're all listed here. You can see everyone we've been working with. But Catherine Degnan, who's an anthropologist at Newcastle, and Joshua Blamire was a postdoc here at Exeter, also an ethnographer, and we're very much concerned with exploring the details of everyday life. We've also worked with political scientists who many of you might know, Susan Banducci, Laszlo Horvath, Dan Stevens and Andrew Jones, who are all at Exeter. And they'll wince at this, but my sense of what my colleagues are doing, they're concerned with collecting and analysing large-scale public opinion survey and media data, and that's what they brought to the project. And then we've also been working with research software engineers, Freddie Worthington in data science and AI here at Exeter, and him and his team brought expertise to this. And then I also want to mention Janice Huang and Dee Patterson. Janice is a social scientist with qualitative and quantitative background. Dee Patterson is a social anthropologist. They were both based at Exeter, and they joined our team to help bring all these data sets together. So today, Helen and I will discuss how we bring this diverse interdisciplinary group together with Helen's artwork in an exhibition website that we call Red, Amber, Green Britain. And the aim of the website and the exhibition, I actually call it an exhibition because I think website sounds too perfunctory. The aim of the exhibition is to explore how people across identities experience the pandemic and Brexit. So I'm going to tell you a bit about, where this project came from. So our project began in September 2018, when Brexit was the big news story, and we set out to examine people's experiences of Brexit across identities and places in England. From September 2018 to January the 31st, 2020, Independence Day, when Britain officially left the EU, Degnan, Blamire and myself conducted residential ethnographic fieldwork exploring people's experiences of Brexit. So I conducted the fieldwork in the southwest, Degnan carried out fieldwork in the northeast, and Blamire conducted fieldwork in the East Midlands. Susan Banducci, Laszlo Horvath, and Dan Stevens and Andrew Jones mapped and coded the media on Brexit. Now, so by the time of the first national lockdown in March 2020, Degnan, Blamire and myself had conducted between us 180 in-depth conversational style interviews on the themes of Brexit, identity, belonging and the media with residents from across England and across ethnic, racial, class, migrant, national, generational, gender and place-based identities. We had also each spent considerable time conducting fieldwork on Brexit within diverse community settings. So, for example, I had many informal conversations with people about Brexit within community centres, with farmers at their weekly livestock markets. I also regularly shadowed campaigners on their street stalls and attended election hustings and rallies. So we did these interviews, but in the context of all this kind of hanging around. In one sense, Brexit is everywhere and nowhere at that time, so there wasn't a clear field site we could plonk ourselves in. So we moved around and fitted the context in which we were working. At the time of the first national lockdown in March 2020, it seemed like a natural progression to return to our field sites and to ask people about their experiences of the pandemic. So basically, we're writing up this material, we've got it all, pandemic hits like all of us, what to do now? So it seemed very much like a natural progression to ask all these people we were in contact with about the pandemic. And this is because there's an organic synergy between the types of questions that we were posing vis-a-vis Brexit that were also relevant to the pandemic. And I felt this very strongly at the time. For example, questions concerning people's senses of belonging or lack thereof to their local place in the British nation. Their views on politics and politicians, their experiences of inequalities and how their identities mediate those experiences, as well as their media practices. The plan then was for us ethnographers to return to our field sites and for the political scientists to continue mapping the media, as well as conduct a three-way panel quantitative survey with hundreds of respondents drawn from across England on the research themes. And it was in this moment, Helen joined our project during the first national lockdown. She was a participant in my Brexit fieldwork in the Southwest, and we discovered that we shared a common interest in British histories of empire, exploitation and colonialism. At the time we met, Helen was working on an exhibition on Captain Cook's voyages of discovery on the so-called New World. And the anthropologists amongst us were in big debates about Captain Cook and Salins, and so, you know, there was a lot going on in empire and so on. Initially, in working with Helen on the COVID project, our aim was to find creative ways to present our research findings to a wider audience beyond academia in a visual form. However, due to the necessity of having to conduct our ethnographic fieldwork for the COVID research online to conform with national lockdown restrictions, we found that Helen's skills as an artist became integral to the design of our fieldwork on Brexit and the pandemic. Interestingly, the pandemic did not disrupt the fielding of quantitative surveys to respondents, but it did disrupt and make us have to rethink our everyday interactions with people through fieldwork. So then, our ethnographic fieldwork on Brexit and COVID was limited to online interviews, which was a new way of working for us. Degnan, Blamire and myself each spoke to 30 out of the original 60 people we had interviewed for our initial fieldworks on Brexit. I spoke to my interlocutors online between October 2020 and April 2021, a timeframe that included 2 national lockdowns. I experienced these online discussions as convivial and free-flowing, in part because I already knew at least most of my interlocutors and the place that they lived. To get our online conversations going, we asked participants to bring along to the interview an object, media image, photograph, anything really that captured for them what I was calling this Brexit COVID moment. Because, you know, most people who'd participated in our research already, they got this sense of what we were interested in. We then used the artifact or how we were approaching things, not what we were interested in, but how we were approaching things. We then used the artifact as a way into talking with our interlocutors about their experiences of the pandemic and Brexit. Crucially, Helen mobilised some of these images to generate drawings and GIFs that captured aspects of our research findings. So then, the ship image is a model of the Titanic with Christmas lights wrapped around it. This model was contributed by Adrian and Peter, who are white men in their 50s. They live in the southwest of England. Adrian is of British and Italian descent. Peter comes from the north of England, and they voted to remain. I met Adrian and Peter online in December 2020, and Helen also met this couple with me online in January 2021 for a photo shoot of the Titanic model, and we continued our conversations together with Helen. And previously I'd been to Peter and Adrian's house, I knew people they knew, and so on, and the model was built by Adrian some time ago. Adrian and Peter both felt that this model encapsulated and symbolised what they perceived to be the social and political collapse and decline of Britain, as well as the reproduction of imperial arrogance on the part of the British government and the general public in the face of Brexit and the pandemic. The Christmas lights signalled what this couple felt to be the nation's blind determination to have Christmas as usual in the face of the pandemic and Brexit. These men related and interpreted the dangers of the pandemic to their lived experiences of the AIDS pandemic in the 1980s and early 1990s. Helen's gift of this image, entitled Blind Faith, captures and conveys these sentiments. On the exhibition website, we quote Adrian's and Peter's reflections as follows. Adrian says, "The iceberg is a very good metaphor for Brexit or COVID, frankly, and how it can bring low a very rich, very powerful nation. 1,500 people died on this ship. And you look, for example, at our COVID death rates are amongst the worst in the world per capita. So I think also in terms of kind of a British project that ended with massive fatalities, then that's another fine metaphor for it as well. However, you wanted to put the Christmas lights around it, didn't you?" he says to Peter. And Peter says, "The Christmas lights to me represents the idea and this sense that in Britain, we've got Brexit looming, which looks likely to be a disaster. We've got COVID, which is already a disaster, and the ways of dealing with it or planning for it as a country, we don't care, as long as we can put up Christmas lights and Christmas and go shopping, and as long as it's got Christmas lights, we don't care, we just don't care, we don't need to think about it, so it will be fine." And so that's it, and that's the same with Brexit and COVID. So, and to give you a further example of this process, here is an image of Chinese healthcare workers contributed by Jack, a white British man in his 20s. Now, Jack is born and bred in the southwest of England. Jack also voted Remain in the EU referendum. For Jack, this image represented the ways in which the pandemic was bringing people together in the face of crisis, while Brexit pushed people apart, making individuals choose what side they were on, either leave or remain. This sentiment of division was conveyed and captured by Jack in a song that he'd heard on a video game. I shall now read part of the extract of our conversation that features on the website alongside Helen's drawings and gifts. So I say, "Tell me," now the recorder's on, "so tell me about the song from the video game." And Jack replies, "The song is based on a song from the 30s, a 1930s song that was sung in the United States called Which Side Are You On?" I think that's the basic name of it. And the song is about a Kentucky coal miners' strike. And the song really resonates with me in Brexit because it was very clear, in my mind, a very clear us and them, as much as that sounds dark. But it was a kind of a genuine fight for genuine political struggle, if that makes sense, and therefore resonated with me. The actual picture is much more, I would say, contrast with that, because it was a picture of, I think, 3 healthcare staff in China hugging in the COVID epidemic and in the pandemic in China. And I thought it's quite a nice image, even though they're covered in coveralls and healthcare PPE, it's still quite nice to see the picture as a kind of contrast, I think. Now, I also invited some participants to reflect on Helen's artwork while she was in the process of drawing it or developing it. This further enabled me and my interlocutors to engage with the themes of the research in new ways and different angles in and through Helen's gifts and drawings. So Hamid, let's look at Hamid's coffee cup. Furthermore, Helen also attended some of my interviews with participants online. She took this opportunity to discuss themes that were of interest to her, and she took screenshots of relevant objects and images that were meaningful to the participants. For example, consider this image of a coffee cup contributed by Hamid, who is a refugee from the Middle East in his 30s and lives in the southwest of England. Hamid was asked by me and Helen to bring objects to our discussion that reminded him of home as well as the pandemic. The coffee and associated aroma of cardamom coffee were deeply nostalgic for him. The drawings came to symbolise Hamid's work with homeless people and the handing out and delivery of free food and drinks to people in the place that he lived during the pandemic. So Helen also inspired by our methodologies. So Helen was also inspired by our methodologies to conduct her own interviews with relatives and friends that live in the Southwest. Here is a drawing based on Helen's interview with her son, who was working at the time of the fieldwork as a newly qualified doctor in a hospital in the Southwest of England, something Helen will talk more about in a moment. This, in turn, inspired me to incorporate my son, some of you know, into the fieldwork by asking him to engage in a series of art exchanges with Helen about his experiences of the pandemic. My son is a white British boy who comes from the Southwest and who was 10 years old at the time of the national lockdowns. Here he responds to Helen's original drawing of a vaccinator. he draws an image of a white masked male being vaccinated and writes in the speech bubble that Helen draws, "I'm going to stab someone, kind of God, I'm a psychopath," to convey what he thinks the vaccinator is thinking. He also draws a genetically cloned and modified apple in response to Helen's drawing of the vaccinator. Now, so that's an insight to a child's way of thinking. But we juxtapose my son's humour, additions and interpretations of Helen's drawing with Alison's responses that give an insight into her experience of the pandemic. Alison is also from the Southwest. She is a white British woman in her 50s and has 33 years' experience of working in the NHS. Alison writes empathetically in Helen's speech bubbles, "No time to waste, I'm searching for the hero inside myself. 2 years later, I'm still here, bored, lonely and tired, back to normal, question mark." Helen's drawings, inspired by the images and reflections of our interlocutors, were also deployed in the design of an interactive app, which Helen will talk about in more detail in a moment. What I want to do now is briefly reflect in some more detail on how working with Helen in this way has enhanced our online fieldwork practices. So firstly, and crucially for me, it opened up a pathway to discuss the themes of the research on the participants' own terms, and so offering new starting points for discussion akin to the type of material gained through ethnographic fieldwork. In this way, the introduction of visual objects offered a richness to the interview material that ethnographic observation and participation usually brings to fieldwork. Secondly, this method provided a creative avenue for connecting up the fieldwork sites. For example, I discussed with my interlocutors from the Southwest their views on Helen's artwork inspired by images produced by Blamaya's participants from a rural market town in the East Midlands. As you can see in this slide, so that's where Josh was. This allowed me to put our interlocutors' experiences of the pandemic from different parts of England into conversation with each other in a unique way. Helen calls this drawing and photograph too close. The photograph was contributed by George, a white British man in his 60s, who lives in the market town in the East Midlands where this photo is taken. George voted to leave the EU. I discussed this image with Matthew, who is a white man in his 20s and who voted Remain and who lived in the southwest of England during the first national lockdowns. Our conversations went as follows. So I said, reflecting on the photograph, this is all online, I say, I counted them, the people, there's 5, and this is in, and I say the name of the county, which is actually in tier 3 now. So you're allowed to meet outside in no more than 6, but yes, but that does feel too close, doesn't it? And Matthew replies, it all looks slightly unnerving, which at no other time that I've been alive would it feel weird to have other people just standing around in a circle having a chat. So in addition to this, Helen's artwork also enabled us to open up discussions with participants about their media practices in the face of Brexit and the pandemic. That is to say, some of our interlocutors brought to their interviews media images to capture what this Brexit COVID moment means to them. And some of Helen's artwork was inspired by her own interpretations of media images of the pandemic and Brexit, which we also discussed with our participants. On the website, we have also annotated Helen's gifts and drawings of key media events with our interlocutors' thoughts, reflections, and lived experiences of those events during the pandemic. For example, Helen's gift of the toppling of Edward Colston's statue in Bristol during the first national lockdown is accompanied with the thoughts and reflections of Lindsay. Helen knew Lindsay well through her community-based artwork projects in the Southwest and introduced us to each other. Lindsay is from the north of England and describes herself as of mixed heritage. She's in her 60s and lives in the Southwest. Lindsay voted to remain in the EU, and we discussed the toppling of Colston's statue as follows. So I say, but to go back to the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement and its influence on Britain, how do you think it has been received? And Lindsay said, I was so blown away and heartened because all these young people were out protesting and wanted to have their voices heard. People weren't sure whether they should or shouldn't be out. The government advice was very vague. Most people were wearing masks or people were giving them out. I questioned whether I should or shouldn't go, but I just felt I had to go. It was such an important message that was being said. It was not just about George Floyd, it was about how Black people in the criminal justice system are less likely to be treated equitably. And Helen says, you told me something quite shocking afterwards. You told me where there was this spike in hate crime because of and Lindsay says, yes, whenever people raise their voices in support, there's always a minority element of people who feel threatened and who will actively go out to abuse people based on their skin colour or religion. There are also people who don't like change, who are happy with the status quo. With Black Lives Matter, people raise their voices in support. However, there is a mindset of people who have actively tried to discredit the movement. You know, but it was a really peaceful protest. It was lovely, a lovely atmosphere, a lot of music. You know, it was really nice. Obviously, some people find that threatening. So I say, and the young people, was that across ethnicity? And Lindsay says, yes, it was across all ethnicities. I mean, don't forget, we're mostly white people in the Southwest as well. We've got more diversity than we ever had. Helen said, do you think, Lindsay, that all the energy and the hope and the optimism and the coming together in that moment is carrying on? I mean, in a much less significant way, but in my mind, a sort of parallel way, with everyone coming out and clapping for the NHS. And Lindsay says, but I thought that. I didn't like the clapping for the NHS though, because I always thought if you like what they do, you should give them a pay rise. So I didn't go to clap for them because I thought that was government led. Give them the bloody clap. That is all you have got, the clap. So then, here you can clearly see a synergy and symbiotic relationship and exchange between Helen's artistic interpretations of media images with our interlocutors' deeply personal experiences of the pandemic. So collaboration with Helen also offered us a new way to bring together the quantitative political science-driven and ethnographic anthropologically orientated aspects of our research. This was achieved by working with Laszlo Horvath, a project research fellow and political scientist, as well as software engineers, Freddie Worthington and James Allen, based at Exeter, to develop an interactive app that asks users to answer a series of survey questions on technologies of surveillance in the pandemic. The survey is accompanied by Helen's gifs and images drawn from the fieldwork and the media. In this way, then, we developed a new way of integrating artwork, survey methodologies, and ethnographic fieldwork materials via the design of a provocative, interactive app aimed at engaging members of the public in our research. We could not have imagined this innovative integration of different aspects of our research materials and methodologies outside of the research process. Helen will say more about the process of developing the app in a moment, but this slide gives you an idea of what it looks like. And it was actually down for technical reasons, but it's now back up. You can get yourself on the app if you would like to. Okay, so working with Helen also provoked me to reflect in new ways on questions of anonymity in the process of fieldwork. My instinct, given the polarising, personal and emotive topics we were exploring across identities and with Leavers and Remainers, is to protect the anonymity of my fieldwork participants at every conceivable turn and in every way. So I found myself repeatedly asking Helen to blank out and hide faces and other signs that might reveal an individual's identity. This process is evident in this photograph given to me by Dave and Joan, whose last trip outside of the Southwest before the national lockdown was to London to celebrate Britain's exit from the EU on January the 31st, 2020 in Parliament Square. This need for anonymity became heightened for me in the knowledge that this exhibition was to go live on the internet. This was something that Helen found odd from her point of view as a fine artist, but also creatively intriguing. Helen's questioning of my practices in turn has pushed me to think about processes of anonymity in ethnographic fieldwork. What is the point of anonymity? Who is it protecting? And what is lost in blanking out people and places? These were questions I found myself discussing with some of my interlocutors for the first time. Helen will elaborate on anonymity from her point of view in a moment. But first, let us briefly consider Dave's and Joan's response to Helen's anonymisation of their photograph. Dave and Joan are British and come from the southwest of England. They're a white couple in their 60s who voted to leave the EU, which is demonstrated by their attendance at this rally. So Dave says, there isn't any point in having a close shot with us in, particularly because it does away with the group thing. And it's very much a group thing, isn't it? And I say, right, you see, that's a brilliant observation, because I know you and not anyone else, you know, in the photograph. But for you, it's a group thing. It's a collective experience. And Joan says, absolutely. And I say, so what does it feel like, us blanking you out? And Dave said, it feels like we've been phased out because we're going to be persecuted, or worse still. And I say, I wouldn't have come up with that, because my idea is of protecting you. It's just that I do it for everyone, not because I feel you're going to be persecuted, but because I just feel that, yes, because it's my job in a way to make sure that no one can identify you. So how do you feel, Joan, about being recognised, I asked? And Joan says, it doesn't bother me. I wouldn't be there if I didn't want to be recognised. We would be in that many cameras in the area. It really makes no difference to me. If you don't want to be recognised, don't be there. So what is also significant for me about the exhibition website is the way in which it provides an overview of some of the emerging themes of our research in a way that is accessible to a diversity of audiences, something that an academic article does not set out to do. And finally, my last thought for now is on mine and Helen's shifting relationship between being the researcher and the so-called research. I first went to Helen's house to interview her for my research on Brexit, identity, the media and belonging, at the time when the British Parliament was fiercely debating the terms and conditions on which Britain should leave the EU. On this occasion, I was the ethnographer and Helen was the research participant. Most recently, I visited Helen's house to be interviewed and photographed by her. In the photographs, I wear lenses with her artistic interpretations of our participants and media images imprinted on them. This time, Helen was the researcher and I was the research participant. Moreover, in wearing these lenses, I quite literally saw the world through my participants' worldviews. But yet, from another perspective, the wearing of these lenses also represents for me the way in which the ethnographer is the embodied instrument of fieldwork. We are the collector, transcriber and interpreter of our partial, fluid and deeply positioned ethnographic material. And now Helen and I will swap space.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, that notice of water. So I'm going to talk to you about my way into the residency. So before working with Catherine and this research project, and prior to the pandemic, I would often find myself buried in the archives of museums or historic collections, planning new work with the significant benefit of hindsight. So these pieces were actually part of the work that I did for an exhibition called Neo-Geographies, which was a touring exhibition looking at the visual legacy of Cook's 3 voyages through the lens of his artist and how partisan that was. And my background is in making multiples and laser cutting. So objects for me and multiples exist differently depending very much on the context. So obviously this dress, which I called appropriation dress, is situated in Whitby Museum, which is a bit like the Pitt Rivers Museum. It's sort of stuck in time in the 19th century, and as you can see, very colonial displays in the background. So the reading of that was very different than working with mixed heritage models wearing the same dress and entering into kind of dialogue about that. So thank you, Catherine. So obviously the pandemic changed everything. I couldn't laser cut anything, I couldn't make anything. So I had to completely reinvent both my working processes, my interactions and my output. My work needed to be fast-paced and respond to the imperative of ever-changing news feeds and public opinion. My interactions with the team were remote. On top of that, I was shielding, as I am still the sole carer, for my severely immunosuppressed mother. So the whole physical realm became a very different space for me. So forays into the real world were especially poignant and challenging in the early days of the pandemic. My son had just graduated from medical school in the summer of 2020 and had been fast-tracked to the front line. The new world order felt very real and very remote simultaneously. So, working remotely, I was forced to embrace the virtual realm and contemplate the implication of no physical output or culminating exhibition of work. We were in a constantly evolving situation, sometimes with little or no benefit of hindsight or even a sense of what lay ahead. Every day we awoke to a state of flux and uncertainty. So to begin with, I needed to understand how information was collected, analysed across different academic disciplines of the research team, and how to build for myself an overarching methodology. And then to think about the impact of the research and how then to reach different audiences outside academia. I was curious to understand how a survey can be designed to generate specific types of responses and data sets. I set about comparing data visualizations generated from, say, a political survey to anonymized transcripts generated from ethnographic fieldwork interviews. I wanted to explore visual forms that might enable these two approaches to come together. I wanted to think about how best the analysis might be fed back to those very participants who generously donated, and for me that's quite a loaded word, their data, their thoughts and their intellectual property. I became interested in the question of whether survey participants needed to be incentivized to get involved in academic research, or what might motivate them to do so. I also wondered why certain ethnographic research participants did in fact put themselves forward to be included in the research in the first place. I wanted to know whose voices formed part of the response and to think about whose voices might be absent and why. What was happening in the margins or periphery outside the reach of surveys and interviews? These are ongoing preoccupations in my work to date. So I signed up to an academic survey platform to put myself into the hot seat, to think about how surveys are designed or not to engage the eye as well as the brain. I haven't really participated in any academic surveys until this moment. So for me, I had a sort of fresh eye, which was quite interesting. I wanted to establish whether it was out of interest, a personal agenda, or the prospect of a financial reward in the case of students that was a motivating factor. It was very enlightening. I reflected on why I had wanted to be involved in ethnographic interviews in the past, notably the one with Catherine on Brexit. I thought about how these interviews provided a platform for me to express strong political views without being challenged, and then to have the validation of my words being transcribed for posterity. It was a cathartic process. It made me realise that this involvement on my part could also be understood as an extension and reinforcement of my own peer group identity and a collective sense of social responsibility. As we are constantly bombarded with requests to review products, their performance, their value for money, and we are constantly asked to evaluate our professional and personal selves and our peers, how do we counter survey fatigue? So I wanted to create a series of visual provocations as opposed to written questions to engage the viewer, grab their attention, to get them to engage with research themes in different ways. I was interested in creating a survey platform that would not seek categorical answers, but instead foster a spirit of empathy and be able to give shape to more ambiguous and non-verbal answers. Oh, that's okay. So as Catherine has explained, working with the ethnographers, we invited research participants to share images and to bring objects to Zoom interviews that were particularly symbolic to them of this moment in time. For me, it was important to communicate in a non-verbal, non-categorical way that embraced some of the ambiguities that defined the moment and that allowed for different levels of engagement and interpretation. These visuals had the potential to articulate an unknown space and to give form to feelings, memories, and experiences in more fluid ways. Screenshots from these interviews led directly into the creation of some of the artwork, which Catherine's already mentioned. So the resulting drawings and GIF animations referred very much to the circularity of news headlines, government statements, information and disinformation. The looping, pulsing animations were designed to invoke this prevailing climate of confusion, a culture of distrust, denial, mixed messaging, and constant U-turns. Thank you. So red, amber, green, the colour scheme. So these colours were, of course, everywhere in all messaging. So government messaging, national media, social messaging. So as we remember, they denoted which countries you could travel to, whether or not you could enter a supermarket or have to wait outside with your trolley, whether a hospital ward was a red zone for COVID or a green zone for non-COVID. So these colours had a lot of charge, and therefore these colours were selected to run throughout the visuals and articulate this stop-start culture. And importantly for me, amber became the colour of confusion, the unknown and the non-binary space. So these were some of the stills from some of the animations, and at this stage, think about red, amber, green. There are sort of other ideas being suggested through this that I'll talk about a bit later. So this was just a sort of prototype for a light box and potentially a legacy piece. So the GIF form, which became very important, also mirrored the sort of prevailing internal dialogues around decision-making and weighing up risk versus benefit or dithering. So should I have a vaccination? Should I wear a mask, which is ongoing? Should I travel abroad? Should I eat out to help out? Should I go to a football match? Should I join a protest? Discussions with Catherine about the need for anonymity in the fieldwork gave rise to questions around the visualization of anonymity. These questions revealed powerful, sometimes racialized associations suggested by blanks, cutaways, and pixelations. Many of the subsequent animations therefore feature blanks, blackouts, whiteouts, or shadows and absences in flickering colours. The anonymous space is a rich metaphor, a kickback against stereotypes and binaries. The colour of the blanking out becomes significant. To blank out a face or person in black or white provokes powerful associations. The blanks infer absence and omission as well as anonymity. Some participants were keen to circulate their images, and they had this sort of sense of ownership and wanted to share them on social media and relinquish their anonymity. But this was a practice that Catherine discouraged for ethical reasons. So the form for me, as I think I mentioned, I had sort of reinvent my whole way of working. Usually I work with sort of digital media, laser cutting, sculpture. So the idea of how close to reality, how figurative, how abstract were all sort of concepts that I wrestled with. We had quite a lot of submissions of participant material that were photographs, their own photographs. But the charge of a photograph with a blanked out face is very different to a drawing. A drawing has a more notional sense. So my use of pencil drawing as a recording tool enabled, I think, a more humanizing process and a much more analog touch. in contrast with the inevitably digital platform. So the subjective process of making drawings from supposedly objective but often highly edited press images is in stark contrast to the presentation of these images and animations on a variety of digital platforms and apps. I was conscious of adopting a drawing style that was more analytical and less intuitive than my usual way of working. It was a nod towards objectivity and a clear reference, therefore, to source material. However, once I started developing individual frames for the animations, I started to experiment with the subtext to draw out wider meanings and potential readings. I wanted to use drawing as opposed to photography, as it is a step removed from reality in the visual sense, from the clinical gaze of the camera lens. The figures are no longer individual portraits. Identity is softened so that figures can become more metaphorical or notional. They invite us to contemplate the wider implications of any given scenario. While working in this way, I thought about the role of court artists as witnesses of sorts. Their chalk drawings of defendants are a halfway house between reality and abstraction, a safe space where photography is not allowed. So some of our interviewees' responses to Brexit and COVID we felt were really appropriate for developing into a series of 20 animations for the interactive app that we designed in collaboration with Laszlo Horvath, the political scientist and our team member. The app uses animations as visual provocations to encourage participants to consider various scenarios that relate to protecting privacy or consenting to surveillance. And Laszlo had already done some research into the track and trace app, which was contentious at the time and was something that we sort of wanted to think about further. So we did get funding from the Science Gallery of Detroit, which was great. So they were really interested in working with us to deconstruct the app for a physical space in the museum at Michigan State University. So they gave us some funding. And what was quite interesting in this moment where we couldn't meet them, we had all these meetings online, was to think about some kind of physical production of this exhibition. So this image is of the deconstructed version of the app in Detroit as part of the exhibition called Tracked and Traced in 2020. So at the time, Detroit was in the grip of the pandemic, and we had to navigate the constraints of organising a physical exhibition remotely. So we worked with the design team to factor in quite stringent health and safety considerations, which added, I think, more resonance again and another dimension to the content of the exhibition. In the gallery setting, the animations were housed in a series of 4 kiosks. Participants had to follow a set route around the gallery to arrive at the exhibit and had to maintain social distancing at all times. They engaged with the visuals as standalone artworks in the first instance, before responding to the questions in the app via their smartphones. Participants could then opt to contribute their responses, which were then uploaded on a constantly evolving spatial map that was projected onto the wall and became a kind of visual tapestry. Oh, sorry, it's okay. In the app, participants are randomly assigned.
The avatar's gone. Oh, yeah, I didn't know that. Never mind.
Oh, there it is.
Is that it? Yeah.
Thank you. In the app, the participants are randomly assigned an avatar in order to provoke a considered, empathetic response. So each set of descriptors are also randomly assigned to the avatar. So you see this example here, the participant inputs a name, they've got no control over the descriptors, and then they navigate the questions. I think Catherine showed you a slide of one of the questions, but they have to think differently. So this part of the app is really significant, I think, that they have to navigate as somebody else. And then move on to...
That's it.
Oh yeah, sorry. So yeah, so obviously we started to have lots of different outputs for our material, which became really interesting. And I think we're still at the stage of sort of thinking of all the different outputs. But the website was the thing that quite early on we decided on producing, because it was a good way of containing and curating the material. So there are different categories that have different elements of ethnographic material that I responded to there. So if in fact, I don't know if any of you have had the chance to look at the website, maybe that's better than me talking about it, but I think in the information about this seminar, there was the website. So yes, maybe have a look, but there's all sorts of things to navigate through on the website, and it's very comprehensive. So that's the sort of digital production phase. But what came about with Detroit is this idea of this sort of hybrid production, which I think on this side of the pandemic, hybrid ways of working seem to be particularly resonant. And also the form of all the GIF animations, which in my mind was always thinking about a lens or thinking about a portal, the fact that all of our screens are backlit. So thinking about working with something much more analog, much more historic. So working in glass, so you can see, and you can take some of these out in a minute. We use some of the imagery from the GIFs, and they're kiln fired onto glass, so they become objects that we actually wear and think about in a really different way. I think there's another, oh, sorry. So I mean, this slide just really kind of clearly represents that. And this was one of the media images that we worked with as well. And then that then becomes obviously a lens.
Or by a participant there.
Oh yes, I should say yes, worn by one of our participants as well, interestingly.
Yeah.
So there's some more examples. Yes, so individually, and then obviously how they respond to light. And we're thinking now, moving forwards, about how a physical exhibition might look, or maybe taking a series of portraits with some of the participants. Obviously, Catherine modelled very nicely, haven't you? So that's a fantastic example. And finally, if I just talk about my takeaways.
Yeah.
Oh. So since last summer, I'm now artist in residence, interestingly, with the local NHS Trust for 2 years. And they were very interested in the research that I've done with you here. And I was just going to sort of round up a little bit of what I've learned. So periods of enforced remote working have really challenged my interest in channeled, I should say, my interest in other digital platforms, such as animation, sound, web design, and app design. This has allowed me to co-create work with a very different carbon footprint that communicates across space and time, and that is quite literally non-infectious. Working with Catherine and an interdisciplinary research team has brought a whole new focus to the ways in which I interact with subjects and themes in my work and how I gather material. This has very much informed the way I'm currently engaging with staff at the local NHS Trust. Oh, I've lost the notes here. Apologies. So my residency is staff-facing and is funded by NHS Charities Together to support issues of staff well-being. Again, I find myself working in an unprecedented historical moment this time for the NHS, and in my notes I've written this in capitals because I got it in a staff email because it's now called perma crisis in the NHS. So this is what it is, this is the new norm. But this time my experience is a very physical and potentially infectious environment. So it's complete contrast. I have the challenge of finding the time and the place in which to interact with a deeply stressed, often alienated workforce. I tread a fine line between truth-telling and assuming a public relations role. My presence is sometimes met with hostility, but often with warmth and openness. I have become acutely aware that an online interaction is very different to a physical one, now in a medical environment, and the responses are very different. I think that's it. It's fine, just got one more bit. I often think about the ethnographic interviews with Catherine. I think about the said and the unsaid. I think about self-censorship and safe spaces. So I seek out the staff rooms, the picket lines, offices, and locations where staff either feel invisible and free to talk, or highly visible and in the glare of often partisan media. The staff have become co-producers and collaborators, truth-tellers and antagonists.
So working with Helen in this way, so this is just to give you, actually this slide just shows you how the app has built into it, or rather the website has built into it. It captures data of who in the world is looking at it. So interestingly, lots of people in Devon but so are people, where was it in consent? Oh, sorry. Oh, God, that's interesting. It's touch screen. I haven't got one like that. Yeah, anyway, and also in the States. But, working with Helen in this way during the pandemic has opened up creative and new ways of working for me too. It's given me new ways to engage with interlocutors in the research process. Helen, the research team, and our interlocutors are the co-authors of this exhibition. It also raises questions that I would like to think more about with Helen regarding the synergies between art and anthropological methodologies, as well as offering pathways to open up our findings to audiences outside of academia. So as Helen mentioned, we're now looking to make a physical presentation to engage and feedback to communities. We've also been working with early career academics and more established colleagues to bring together an edited collection of articles on everyday experiences of Brexit and the pandemic in these tumultuous times. And we hope to deploy Helen's artwork in a creative way to make this collection of essays accessible to a wide readership. And then I just wanted to show you who our project partners are and our funders. And also I just wanted to, we have alongside the exhibition website, we have academic websites for the two projects that funded this research. So do check those out. Designed by Michelle. And the logos, he did the logos brilliantly. Yeah.